Hello and welcome to part 2 of the virtual lesson on cell transport. In this lesson we're going to be looking at osmosis and active transport. Osmosis is the diffusion of water from a dilute solution to a concentrated solution through a partially permeable membrane. And you should remember from the diffusion video that a partially permeable membrane is something that lets the small things through but not the bigger things. So water can diffuse in the diagram on the video, but sugars cannot because they're too big to fit. It means it allows small molecules to pass through, but ions or large molecules won't. Think a little bit like your bedroom door. A sumo wrestler will not fit through your door, but a really skinny person will definitely fit through your door. So it lets some things through, but not others. Let me try and explain that a little bit simpler. Water moves from a high concentration to a low concentration of water, or where there's not very much solute to where there's a lot of solute. Now, solute is just a fancy way of saying salt or sugar, and a way to think of it is that water loves sugar or water loves salt, and it will always move towards it. You can see this on the diagram that's on the right, that on the outside of the cell there is a lot of water, so it's a really high concentration of water outside the cell. Inside the cell it's a low concentration, so we do know that the water is going to move from high to low. It's going to go down the concentration gradient because remember it goes with the flow, it's a passive process, it's going to go into the cell. Another way to think of it is it's going from where there is a low solute amount, which is outside, to where there's a high solute amount, which is on the inside of the cell. Now there's an example here that we're going to try as a question. So the rectangle is a beaker, and the dotted line down the middle represents Viscin tube, and Viscin tube is like a pretend partially permeable membrane. So basically you can see with the dotted line it's going to let small things through but not big things. Now let's say you've added loads of sugar in there. We have one side that's a really high solute, one side that's a low solute. What I want you to think about is which way is the water going to move? So our water is going to be attracted towards that salt or towards that sugar, and it's going to actually move towards side B. And if you did this as a practical, you would actually be able to see the water level would be higher in side B than side A. So the water is gone from a high water concentration towards a lower water concentration, from a lower solute to a higher solute. So it's gone from high to low. So osmosis is how water moves in and out of plant cells. As water moves into a plant cell, the cell wall stops the cell from bursting. We say that the cell is turgid, and turgid is just a fancy word for swollen. You can see on the picture that the vacuole is filling all the space and pushing against the cell wall. This is useful as it gives plant stems support. So that is a swollen fat plant cell, which is what plants like. In our cells, we don't want turgid fat cells that are filling with water because we don't have a cell wall. So if water keeps entering our red blood cells by osmosis, our cells will eventually burst. It's why in a hospital an IV drip isn't pure water, even though it looks like it, because if it was, our cells would burst. Instead, it's a mixture of salts and sugars so that our cells aren't at risk. Now, the complete opposite of turgid is flaccid. When water moves out of a plant cell's vacuole, it becomes flaccid. And if a lot of water leaves the cell, the cytoplasm peels away from the cell wall, and we say that the cell has undergone plasmolysis. A flaccid cell, the vacuole is much smaller. You can see on the diagram it's taking up a lot less space. So we have turgid and flaccid as the ways that water moves in and out of a plant cell via osmosis. With osmosis and diffusion, they're both going with the flow. They're going from high to low. But sometimes we want to go the opposite way. We want to go low to high. We want to move against the concentration gradient or up it. Now, as you can imagine, if you're not going with the flow, you need something to help you out. You need a little bit of energy to be able to move things in the opposite direction. If you imagine you were in a car or a bike on the top of a hill, if you went over the edge, you could go all the way down without pedaling or without having your foot on the accelerator, because you're going with the flow, you're going from high to low. If you want to go up that hill, you need to put some energy in. There's no way you can get up there without actually having to put some energy in yourself. Now, in cells, this is called active transport. So imagine this fella here, his name's Jeff. Jeff's at the top of a waterfall. He's where there's a high concentration, and he's going with the flow currently. He's going where there's a low concentration. So at the minute, it's either diffusion or osmosis if there's a partially permeable membrane in the middle. So potentially, in this weird analogy, if there was stones in the way that he could somehow fit through, but his paddle couldn't, you could say, okay, that's a partially permeable membrane. Now, let's ignore the fact that this would be defying the laws of physics itself. Let's pretend somehow he's supernatural and is able to paddle back up and defy the laws of gravity. If he wanted to go from low to high in order to not be plunging to his imminent death, he's got to put some energy in. He needs to go against the flow from a low concentration to high, and he can do that by putting some energy in, but it requires the respiration in the mitochondria of your cells. So glucose and oxygen combine in the mitochondria in your cells to give you the energy needed so that when active transport needs to happen, you've got the energy to do it. You've got the energy to push things inside your cells. Now, some real life examples that aren't a crazy analogy that I've tried to come up with is root hair cells. So in this diagram here, the red circles are nutrients. You can see that there's a higher concentration of nutrients in the roots than in the soil. So there's more red dots in the root hair cells than the soil. Now, I want you to think about this question. The video is going to pause and I want you to answer it for me. So what would diffusion do here with the nutrient particles? So if it was down to diffusion, they would move out of the root hair cell into the soil, because remember, diffusion goes from high to low. So if it's higher in the root hair cells, it's going to diffuse out of the cell into the soil where it's lower. Now, we don't want that to happen in a plant. A plant wants to absorb every nutrient it can in case it needs it later, and diffusion would do the complete opposite. So it needs active transport to force the molecules, the ions on the outside that are in the low concentration, to force them inside where it's the high concentration, and it has to use energy to make that happen. Another example of active transport is in marine animals, where salt glands push salt out of the organism into the salt water, and they do this by active transport. There's obviously a lot more salt in the water around the turtle, so the salt glands use active transport to push the salt from inside the body where it's lower into the water where it's higher. So salt's diffusing into the body of a turtle. If you think back to when we were talking about osmosis, if there's too much salt inside the turtle, the water is going to flow inside of the turtle by osmosis, which means that it's going to cause the animal cells to burst. Remember, animal cells do not have cell walls, so if water is flowing into the turtle by osmosis, its cells will burst. So it needs active transport to force that salt out so that osmosis doesn't happen as well. An example in us is digestion. So active transport is really useful in digestion. When we first eat food, so for example you've eaten a cake or a chocolate bar, there's a really high concentration of glucose in your intestines. So that means at first it can transfer by diffusion. So this is going to happen there. It's going to go from high to a low concentration. So it's travelling from here where it's high inside your intestine to low into your bloodstream. Now, to get the most out of our food, like the plant, we have to keep drawing that glucose out of our small intestine. Now, if we were relying on diffusion, that wouldn't happen, because right now you can see that the balance inside the intestines is really low. It's much higher on the outside. So if we were relying on diffusion, it'd be going back in, which is the complete opposite of what we want. So we need active transport to force those remaining glucose particles to come back out into our bloodstream. So we need energy to do this, and this obviously happens in the mitochondria in our cells, giving us energy, and they move against the concentration gradient. So they're going from low to high. It costs energy to move things, and inside your cell membrane you have what we call transport proteins, or they're sometimes called carrier proteins. And what they do is a little bit of magic, where they're able to act a bit like a gateway and take those low concentration particles on one side and push them into the cell or out of the cell, depending on the circumstances, to where it's a high concentration. And you can see that on the diagram, that on the right, where it's a low concentration with a little bit of energy, they are getting pushed into the cell where it's a higher concentration. So I want you to pause the video here and to have a go of these 3 questions, which is number 1, state what happens to the rate of diffusion as the temperature increases. Number 2, red blood cells are placed on a microscope slide. Why do the cells increase in size when water is added to the slide? And number 3, give 3 differences between active transport and diffusion. So let's look at the answers. The first one is that the rate of diffusion will increase. We should remember this from the diffusion video. If we're giving particles more heat, we're giving them more kinetic energy, they're moving around a lot more, therefore diffusion will happen much quicker because they're spreading around much quicker. In the question about the red blood cells, the cell's cytoplasm is more concentrated than water, so water moves across the cell membrane into the cytoplasm. This causes the cells to expand. So that water is attracted towards that more concentrated, sugary, salty solution, and it will cause your cells to expand. And remember, we don't have a cell wall, so our cells will burst eventually. And finally, give 3 differences between active transport and diffusion. Diffusion is from high to low, whereas active transport is low to high. Diffusion does not need cell membranes, but active transport does. Diffusion does not need energy, but active transport does. So that's all for now. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.